When my successful sister came home after 3 years, she didn't just take my room, she tried to take my grandmother's life savings too. But Grandma had one secret no one saw coming, and when the lawyer walked in, everything they'd planned fell apart. The clock on the wall ticked louder than usual that afternoon, or maybe it only felt that way because Elise Rowan had been listening to it for hours. The house was too quiet, the kind of silence that hummed with expectation. She adjusted the vase of tulips on the table, trying to make the space look a little less lived in. But no matter how much she tidied, this home, Grandma Beatrice's home, carried her warmth, her fingerprints, and her history. When the front door opened, the air changed. Victoria Rowan walked in like she owned the place. Her heels clicked against the hardwood floor, sharp and confident, echoing through the hallway. The same sister who hadn't called in 3 months, who hadn't visited in 3 years, now stood in designer clothes, arms outstretched as though she were doing the family a favor simply by existing. "Elise," Victoria said, her smile carefully painted on. "Still here, I see." Elise forced a polite nod. "Grandma likes the company." Behind her, Margaret Rowan, their mother, appeared, trailing Victoria like a shadow. She was already gushing, her voice sweet and full of pride. "Isn't she glowing? You wouldn't believe how many cases she's won lately. She's on track to make partner next quarter." Elise smiled thinly. She'd learned not to compete with Victoria. You could never win when your opponent had already written the scoreboard. Victoria's eyes scanned the room and then landed on Elise's small desk in the corner. Papers stacked neatly beside her laptop. "Still freelancing?" she asked, pretending to sound curious. "That's nice. Like a hobby?" Margaret chuckled in that dismissive way mothers sometimes do when they don't realize how much it hurts. "You know, Elise, always keeping busy." Elise looked down at her hands. She didn't trust her voice not to crack. Then Victoria said it, the line that made Elise's chest tighten. "I'll need that room upstairs. Nathan and I are staying here while we finalize things for Grandma's care. It'll just be easier if I take over that space." It wasn't a request. Elise felt the sting of it, the casual erasure of her place in the home she'd cared for. She wanted to protest, to say that Grandma needed her stability, not Victoria's plans. But Margaret was already agreeing, nodding eagerly. "Yes, that makes sense. Elise can move her things into the den." The tulips trembled slightly in their vase as Elise brushed past the table, pretending to tidy again just so she wouldn't have to show the hurt on her face. She had given up promotions, vacations, and her own apartment, also Grandma Beatrice wouldn't have to live alone. And now, her reward was to be replaced. As the day dimmed into evening, Elise stood by the kitchen window, watching her reflection blur against the twilight. For the first time, she wondered if she had made a mistake staying, but deep down, something inside her whispered, "Stay patient. They don't know what's coming yet." The next morning, sunlight spilled across the kitchen tiles, too bright, too gentle for the storm brewing inside the Rowan house. Elise stood at the counter, pouring coffee, listening to the muffled voices drifting from the dining room. Victoria's laughter rang out, crisp and polished. Margaret's softer, doting tones followed. It was the same melody Elise had heard her whole life, the duet of admiration between mother and golden daughter. She carried her mug into the room anyway, forcing a small smile, and Victoria looked up from her phone. "Morning, little sis. Hope you don't mind, I reorganized the fridge. There was just so much clutter." Elise's homemade soup jars, Grandma's preserved jams, the quiet rhythm of their everyday life, dismissed in a single word. Margaret looked up from the newspaper. "Victoria's right. The kitchen feels fresher already. Elise, you should take notes from your sister, she knows how to keep things in order." Elise bit the inside of her cheek. The words weren't new, but they landed heavier now. "After last night's ambush, I keep things in order just fine," she said quietly, but it barely registered. Victoria was already pulling out a leather folder, sleek, corporate, and deliberate. "I wanted to discuss Grandma's situation," she began. "She's getting older. Managing a property this size is a lot for her, and for you." Elise froze. "For me?" Victoria leaned forward, her tone silky. "You've been wonderful helping out, but it's time for professionals to step in. There's a lovely facility I've been reviewing, Rosewood Gardens. Private suites, medical staff, all-inclusive care." Margaret clasped her hands together, nodding. "That sounds perfect. She'd have people around her. Maybe she wouldn't feel so lonely." Elise's voice cracked despite her best effort. "She's not lonely. She's happy. She paints, she gardens." Victoria cut her off. "Elise, be reasonable. You can't run a care plan off emotion." Elise felt her pulse in her ears. "I'm not running it off emotion. I'm running it off love." For a brief second, even Margaret's expression faltered, but Victoria's didn't. Her eyes were cool, steady, and calculating. "Let's not turn this into drama," she said smoothly. "Uncle Gerald's arranging a family meeting next week. We'll all talk it through then. It's not personal. Not personal. Elise wanted to laugh at the irony. How easily Victoria made cruelty sound like a decision on paper. When Victoria left the room, Margaret lingered a moment longer. She just wants what's best, she said softly, avoiding eye contact. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Elise stood alone, staring at the folder left behind on the table. A label at the top read, Rowan Family Estate, Beatrice Transition Plan. Her coffee had gone cold outside. A sparrow fluttered against the kitchen window. Beating its wings against invisible glass, Elise whispered to herself, not yet. You're not taking her from me. Not yet. Afternoon sunlight poured through the lace curtains of Beatrice Rowan's sunroom, painting soft gold patterns across her watercolor canvases. The room smelled faintly of lavender and paint thinner, gentle, familiar, and comforting. Elise entered quietly, carrying a tray with tea, just as she had 100 times before. Grandma Beatrice sat by the window, brush in hand, adding delicate strokes of blue to a half-finished landscape. Her silver hair shimmered like frost in the light, but her eyes, sharp and knowing, hadn't lost their fire. Without looking up, she said, I heard voices this morning. Victoria's home, I sent it. Elise froze. You heard that? Beatrice chuckled softly. Darling, you don't live to 78 without learning to recognize the sound of vanity echoing down a hallway. Elise smiled despite the heaviness sitting in her chest. She set the tray down, handing her grandmother the cup. She's talking about selling the house, Grandma. Moving you into some retirement facility. Beatrice dipped her brush in water, unfazed. Of course she is. Victoria was born negotiating. She tried to sell her lemonade stand to the neighbors at age 10. Her humor faded, replaced by a sigh that seemed to carry decades of observation. Your sister never visits unless there's something to gain. I've been expecting this. Elise blinked. Expecting it? Beatrice set the brush aside and finally turned to face her. The afternoon light caught the faint wrinkles around her eyes, deepened by wisdom and time. Elise, my love, I know what she's planning. I've known for months. I only needed to see if you were ready to face it. Ready? Elise asked, confused. Ready for what? Beatrice reached into the side drawer of her writing desk and pulled out a sealed envelope, cream-colored, thick. Marked only with Elise's name in her grandmother's precise handwriting. When the time comes, she said quietly, open this. It's not to be used for revenge, but for protection. Elise frowned, the paper trembling in her hands. Protection from what? Beatrice smiled, a small, knowing curve of her lips. From the kind of people who mistake kindness for weakness. I've seen how your mother and sister look at you. They think patience is surrender. But patience, my dear, is preparation. Elise swallowed hard. Grandma, are you sick? Is something happening you're not telling me? Beatrice shook her head. I'm fine. But this family. It's going to test you. And when it does, you'll need proof of what's right. That envelope holds it. Elise clutched the envelope to her chest, feeling its weight, heavier than paper. Heavier than words. Outside, clouds were rolling in, dimming the soft sunlight across the floorboards. Beatrice turned back to her painting, her brush steady again. Let them talk about money and property. You focus on truth. In the end, truth always cashes the largest check. Elise watched her grandmother in silence, part comforted, part terrified, knowing something irreversible had just begun. Thursday arrived faster than Elise could process. The morning sun spilled across her modest apartment, painting sharp golden lines across boxes she'd hastily packed the night before. The small space felt empty, almost foreign. Her old room at her mother's house had already been stripped of familiarity, repurposed for Victoria and her husband. Elise paused, staring at the floor, trying to summon the calm that her grandmother's words had promised. Patience. Preparation. She repeated it like a mantra, though her chest felt like it was about to split. By mid-afternoon, Elise was on the road, gripping the envelope like a talisman. Rosewood Restaurant was only 10 minutes away, but every traffic light felt like a test, every honk a warning. Her mind raced with every possibility. Could her family actually attempt to move Beatrice into a facility? Could Victoria really manipulate them all to believe Elise was incompetent? And most importantly, would she have the courage to stand up when all eyes were on her? Arriving at the restaurant, Elise paused in the parking lot. The building was grand, polished, and designed for celebrations and formal gatherings, a stark contrast to the warmth and familiarity of her grandmother's home. She adjusted her blazer and took a deep breath, allowing the sunlight to embolden her. The envelope remained hidden in her purse, a secret weapon waiting for the right moment. Inside, the private dining room was already filling with family members. Faces she had not seen in years leaned into conversations that were a mixture of curiosity and judgment. Aunts, uncles, and cousins, all were dressed meticulously, their polished appearances signaling authority, sophistication, and a silent readiness to judge. At the far end of the table, Victoria's smile gleamed, sharp and rehearsed. Her leather portfolio rested on the table. And Elise's stomach sank as she imagined the slides, the charts, and the meticulously planned presentation that would attempt to strip her grandmother of agency. Her mother sat beside Victoria, hands folded, a small, strained smile on her lips. Elise felt the familiar sting of betrayal, the weight of years being ignored, of her care and patience discounted. But Grandma's words echoed in her mind, patience and preparation. Elise straightened her back and scanned the room, noting the subtle glances, the murmurs, and the confidence that came from wealth and perceived success. Victoria's husband, David, hovered near her side like a shadow, nodding at her sister's every gesture. Elise realized that tonight, it wasn't just Victoria she had to face, it was the army of relatives trained to believe appearances over truth, and then she remembered the envelope. Her fingers tightened around it. Inside was proof, documented, undeniable, meticulously prepared. Her grandmother had thought of everything. Every accusation, every manipulation Victoria might try to employ had already been anticipated. Elise could feel a flicker of power, quiet but resolute. This wasn't just about protecting her grandmother. It was about reclaiming her dignity, her voice, and her place in a family that had tried to erase her. Taking a deep breath, Elise stepped fully into the room. The air seemed to change as she moved toward her seat, eyes meeting Victoria's for the briefest moment. The challenge was unspoken but clear. This was going to be a battle of preparation versus arrogance, patience versus entitlement, and truth versus performance, and Elise was ready. Thursday arrived faster than Elise could process. The morning sun spilled across her modest apartment, painting sharp golden lines across boxes she'd hastily packed the night before. The small space felt empty, almost foreign. Her old room at her mother's house had already been stripped of familiarity, repurposed for Victoria and her husband. Elise paused, staring at the floor, trying to summon the calm that her grandmother's words had promised. Patience. Preparation. She repeated it like a mantra, though her chest felt like it was about to split. By mid-afternoon, Elise was on the road, gripping the envelope like a talisman. Rosewood Restaurant was only 10 minutes away, but every traffic light felt like a test, every honk a warning. Her mind raced with every possibility. Could her family actually attempt to move Beatrice into a facility? Could Victoria really manipulate them all to believe Elise was incompetent? And most importantly, would she have the courage to stand up when all eyes were on her? Arriving at the restaurant, Elise paused in the parking lot. The building was grand, polished, and designed for celebrations and formal gatherings, a stark contrast to the warmth and familiarity of her grandmother's home. She adjusted her blazer and took a deep breath, allowing the sunlight to embolden her. The envelope remained hidden in her purse, a secret weapon waiting for the right moment. Inside, the private dining room was already filling with family members. Faces she had not seen in years leaned into conversations that were a mixture of curiosity and judgment. Aunts, uncles, and cousins, all were dressed meticulously, their polished appearances signaling authority, sophistication, and a silent readiness to judge. At the far end of the table, Victoria's smile gleamed, sharp and rehearsed. Her leather portfolio rested on the table, and Elise's stomach sank as she imagined the slides, the charts, and the meticulously planned presentation that would attempt to strip her grandmother of agency. Her mother sat beside Victoria, hands folded, a small, strained smile on her lips. Elise felt the familiar sting of betrayal, the weight of years being ignored, of her care and patience discounted. But Grandma's words echoed in her mind, patience and preparation. Elise straightened her back and scanned the room, noting the subtle glances, the murmurs, and the confidence that came from wealth and perceived success. Victoria's husband, David, hovered near her side like a shadow, nodding at her sister's every gesture. Elise realized that tonight, it wasn't just Victoria she had to face, it was the army of relatives trained to believe appearances over truth, and then she remembered the envelope. Her fingers tightened around it. Inside was proof, documented, undeniable, meticulously prepared. Her grandmother had thought of everything. Every accusation, every manipulation Victoria might try to employ had already been anticipated. Elise could feel a flicker of power, quiet but resolute. This wasn't just about protecting her grandmother. It was about reclaiming her dignity, her voice, and her place in a family that had tried to erase her. Taking a deep breath, Elise stepped fully into the room. The air seemed to change as she moved toward her seat, eyes meeting Victoria's for the briefest moment. The challenge was unspoken but clear. This was going to be a battle of preparation versus arrogance, patience versus entitlement, and truth versus performance, and Elise was ready. Elise's hand tightened around the envelope hidden in her purse, her pulse thundering like a drum in the quiet dining room. The family had leaned in, eyes sharp, waiting to see her crumble under Victoria's carefully constructed accusations. Victoria, radiant in her polished suit, smirked with confidence, certain she had already won. She clicked through slides detailing withdrawals, medical assessments, and professional care plans, a damning portrait designed to make Elise appear careless. even culpable, and then Elise remembered her grandmother's words, patience. Quiet people see everything. Document everything. Prepare. She exhaled slowly, letting the calm wash over her. Now was the time. Excuse me, Elise began, her voice steady but firm, cutting through the tension like a scalpel. The room turned toward her, a mix of surprise and skepticism etched on every face. Victoria's eyes narrowed, curious, a flicker of irritation crossing her otherwise composed expression. I need to show you something before any decisions are made. With deliberate care, Elise placed the envelope on the table and pulled out a neatly folded sheet of paper, her grandmother's handwriting glimmering in the soft light. The room quieted, the air thick with curiosity and the subtle scent of tension. This, Elise said, sliding the paper forward, is from Grandma Beatrice herself. She prepared this 6 months ago with her attorney, Mr. James Chen. It contains her instructions regarding her finances and her care, instructions that supersede any assumptions we've been making today. Victoria's lips parted slightly, a flicker of panic crossing her face. Her confidence wavered, just enough for Elise to press on. She pulled out the business card and another sheet. These documents authorize me, the grandchild who has actually cared for her for 3 years, to act on her behalf for both medical and financial decisions should she become unable to do so. Gasps erupted around the table. Murmurs of shock, confusion, and disbelief. The tide was shifting. Victoria's hand twitched toward her portfolio, as if to reclaim control, but Elise's eyes met hers. Unwavering. Furthermore, Elise continued, her voice gaining strength with each word. All withdrawals Victoria has accused me of mismanaging were for legitimate purposes, home health aides, renovations for safety, and medical expenses. Every penny is documented. Every transaction verified. My grandmother has authorized this, and her attorney confirms it. The room fell silent. Even Victoria, usually so composed, looked flustered. Her carefully built narrative, the meticulous presentation, the damning evidence of Elise's alleged mismanagement, was crumbling under the weight of truth. Elise reached into her purse one final time and pulled out her phone, displaying a short video recording. Her grandmother's voice filled the room, steady and unwavering. I want to stay in my home. I want Elise to continue managing my affairs. And I want my family to stop treating me like I'm already gone. The projector faded into silence, the slideshow was abandoned, and all eyes turned to the woman they had underestimated. Elise's chest swelled with quiet triumph, not for herself, but for the grandmother whose life had been nearly hijacked by entitlement. Victoria's mask cracked. Her hands shook slightly as she fumbled with her portfolio. The air vibrated with the shock of revelation, control slipping through fingers that had believed themselves unassailable. And in that silence, Elise realized, for 3 years, patience, preparation, and quiet strength had been her allies. Her grandmother had been right. Quiet people do see everything. And today, truth had the final word. The room was heavy with silence, the kind that presses down on your chest and makes every heartbeat thunder in your ears. Victoria, the polished lawyer with the ice-cold courtroom smile, stood frozen, her carefully orchestrated empire of accusations crumbling before her eyes. For the first time, she looked uncertain, vulnerable, and everyone could see it. Elise's gaze swept across the table. Family members, the ones who had nodded along with Victoria's accusations just moments ago, now looked at her with a mix of disbelief and guilt. Aunt Patricia's eyes widened as she muttered under her breath, I didn't know. Uncle Robert shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his stern expression softening. Even David, Victoria's husband, stepped back. Realization dawning on his face as the truth settled in like a cold wind. Victoria's hands trembled as she clutched her leather portfolio, papers rustling like whispers of her failures. This isn't how it looks, she stammered, trying to regain composure. But the dam had broken. No one believed her. The documents in Elise's possession were ironclad, the durable power of attorney, the healthcare authorization, receipts for every expense, a mountain of evidence that Victoria couldn't dismantle. Elise stood, calm and measured, her voice firm. It looks exactly like it is. Every claim you made about me mismanaging Grandma's affairs is false. Every accusation about my care, my responsibility, and my integrity is a lie. The only person acting on Grandma's best interests has been me. The murmurs around the table grew louder. Cousin Sarah leaned forward, pointing at Victoria. I remember now. Those bank trips. You weren't alone. You always left Grandma waiting in the car. Something felt off, but we assumed she needed help. Shock and recognition flickered in the eyes of the others. Pieces of Victoria's charade were falling into place. Victoria's voice broke, wavering with panic. I was just trying to ensure Grandma received proper care. That's all. You don't understand. David stepped toward her, his expression firm, almost accusatory. No, Victoria. I understand perfectly. You weren't thinking about care. You were thinking about money, control, and appearances. And now, everyone sees it. Victoria's face drained of color. The room had turned against her, the credibility she had relied on for years evaporating in front of witnesses. Elise felt a quiet surge of vindication, not gloating, but a deep, resonant justice. She had documented everything, planned meticulously, and remained patient. Her grandmother had trusted her. That trust was stronger than any courtroom tactics or polished slides. One by one, family members began voicing their shock and apology. Aunt Patricia muttered, "I should have listened to you, Elise. I assumed Victoria knew best." Uncle Robert's voice was heavy, laden with remorse. "We were blind. We didn't see what you were doing for her all these years." Elise nodded slowly, letting their words settle. She wasn't seeking their validation, only truth had mattered. And now, truth had prevailed. Victoria slumped in defeat, the carefully constructed image of the perfect lawyer daughter shattered in an instant. Her grandmother, Eleanor, sat quietly in her wheelchair at the end of the table, watching with a soft, proud smile. She had orchestrated this in her quiet, knowing way, ensuring that the family who had underestimated Elise would finally see her worth. The family dynamic had shifted irrevocably. Respect replaced assumptions, truth replaced deception, and Elise's quiet strength became the fulcrum around which everyone else's behavior pivoted. Victoria was exposed, and her influence crumbled. The family had witnessed a new reality, one where integrity, patience, and preparation mattered more than titles, appearances, or empty ambition. Elise exhaled slowly. The battle wasn't just won in documents or legal authority. It was won in truth, witnessed by those who had once doubted her. And as she looked around the room, she realized something powerful. Family wasn't always about blood. It was about who showed up when it mattered most. The tension in the family room had finally dissolved, replaced by an almost surreal quiet. Elise sat across from her grandmother, Eleanor, who radiated a calm resilience that only years of wisdom could forge. The legal battles, the accusations, the whispered betrayals, all of it had come to a head. And now the aftermath felt like a sunrise after a long, stormy night. Eleanor reached out, taking Elise's hand in hers. "You did what I always knew you could," she said softly. Her eyes gleamed with pride, a mix of relief and quiet amusement. "You didn't fight for money. You fought for me. And that's worth more than any inheritance, any document, or any title." Elise squeezed her hand, letting the warmth and reassurance sink in. After years of feeling invisible, overlooked, and undervalued, she finally understood the power she had quietly held all along. It wasn't in grand gestures or loud declarations. It was in patience, preparation, and the willingness to truly see those who depended on her. The first days after the family meeting were a whirlwind. Professional home health aides moved in to assist Eleanor with her daily routines, but Elise remained the anchor. She coordinated schedules, oversaw medical appointments, and even encouraged Eleanor to return to painting, the hobby that had always brought her joy. The sunroom became a studio once more, filled with sunlight, brushes, and the gentle sound of Eleanor's laughter. Elise's business began to flourish, too. Freed from the emotional weight of fighting constant family battles, she threw herself into her work with renewed focus. Her client base grew from 12 steady accounts to 18, and she finally hired an assistant to help manage the workflow. The small apartment downtown, which had felt cramped and temporary, now became a hub of purpose and productivity. Every detail was meticulously organized: files, certificates, client information, each item a testament to her competence and dedication. The family slowly recalibrated. Her mother, Linda, began to visit more often, reading to Eleanor and helping with small tasks around the house. There were apologies, awkward lunches, and tentative conversations, but the pattern of neglect had shifted. Elise had set boundaries, and the family began respecting them. Even Aunt Patricia and Uncle Robert showed signs of genuine change, offering support rather than judgment. Victoria, meanwhile, faced the consequences of her actions. The repayment plan for misappropriated funds was underway, and her professional reputation had suffered irreparably. David had separated from her, unable to reconcile the person he thought he knew with the reality unveiled by Elise's meticulous documentation. The family had learned a harsh lesson: success, when built on deceit, could crumble in an instant. Elise sat in the sunroom one morning, sipping coffee and watching Eleanor confidently navigate the parallel bars set up for her physical therapy. "You're incredible," Elise said, smiling. Eleanor chuckled, her spirit unbroken. "No, my dear. You are incredible. I just gave you the tools. You made it happen." In that moment, Elise understood the real gift she had been given: trust, responsibility, and the knowledge that quiet strength could move mountains. Her grandmother's safety, happiness, and independence were preserved. Her business thrived. And her family, finally, had a new perspective, one rooted in respect, honesty, and the recognition of true care. The final piece of the puzzle was internal, Elisa's own sense of worth. She had learned that being overlooked or underestimated didn't define her. What mattered was the quiet power to act with integrity, to prepare, to protect, and to stand up when it truly counted. And in that quiet, resolute way, she realized, sometimes, the family that matters isn't the one you're born into, it's the one that sees you, supports you, and trusts you when the stakes are highest. Elise smiled at her grandmother. A sunrise painting in the background casting a warm glow over the room. It was a new beginning, filled with promise, justice, and love.